The Nevi'im is prophets, kings, yep, those things, the kind of middle ones. And then the Ketuvim is the kitchen sink. Yep, the wisdom writings. Yep, everything else. Everything else. Yeah. Yep. Yep. So now, the Bible Project has just this really great resources that take some of the information that we already know about all of that stuff, and then these videos show us some kind of important things to keep in mind as we are moving through the narrative. So today we're going to focus on biblical narrative. The next time I'm with you, we're going to focus on biblical poetry. We have talked about before how, especially when you get into the very beginning, you have Genesis beginning with something that really is actually poetry, right? And then you have a narrative that comes after that. So knowing how to read biblical poetry, how it operates, what it's there for, what the different kind of mechanisms are for it, it helps us to understand the broader context much better. Right now we're going to get into, there's some of these short videos on, so we have plot, character, setting, and you'll see how they all kind of fit together.
Different types of literature in the Bible. And we're going to start by talking about biblical narrative.
So narratives, in their most basic form, have characters in a setting going through a series of events. And how those events are selected and then arranged by an author, that's called the plot.
A basic plot line begins with a character in her setting. But then something new or unexpected happens, causing problems that lead up to some ultimate conflict, which is then resolved when the character finds herself changed, living in a new normal.
Now, in reading narratives, it's important to understand every scene in the context of its larger plotline. You can make the same story have a totally different message if you ignore where it occurs in the plot. This happens all the time when people read the Bible.
Really?
Yeah, take for example the story about Gideon. There's this well-known scene where Gideon's trying to discern whether God will help him win a battle, and he requests a sign from God.
Yeah, Gideon lays a wool fleece on the ground and asks that in the morning the fleece be wet with dew, but the ground totally dry, and God does it.
Now, if you look at the scene just by itself, what is the conflict?
How can Gideon know if he'll succeed?
And the resolution?
Test God, ask for a sign, and find out.
Yeah, and that's how many people actually read this story, and it totally misses the point, because it's ignoring the larger plotline.
Really?
Yeah, so let's start from the beginning, you'll get the context. The story begins with Gideon and the Israelites living in fear because they're oppressed by an invading people, the Midianites.
Got it.
Then there's the call to action. God commissions Gideon to defeat the Midianites and save Israel.
Yeah, this is shaping up to be a good story.
But then Gideon's super hesitant, so he asks God to do this magic trick, a sign, so I can know it's really you talking to me. And God stoops to his level. He gives him a sign by lighting this fire on an altar.
So Gideon's already asked for a sign.
And that's not all. In the next scene, God tells Gideon to tear down an altar to another god, but Gideon's so afraid, he does it at night.
So Gideon's skeptical and also a bit of a coward.
Then we come to the moment where Gideon's about to face the Midianites, and he's still uncertain, so he asks for another sign, the fleece. He says, I want to know if you'll save Israel by my hand.
And God gives him that sign.
And he's still uncertain, so he asks for even one more sign, which is just a variation of the previous sign.
Okay, so Gideon's asking for way too many signs.
Exactly. In the larger context, it's clear the plot conflict is not how can Gideon discern the mysterious will of God. The real conflict is when will this guy get his act together and start trusting God?
Okay, so then what's the resolution?
Well, we have to keep reading. So Gideon gathers this huge army, 30,000 soldiers to fight the Midianites, and God says, no, way too many men. He whittles the army down to 300.
Why would he do that?
Well, Gideon's been testing God, so now God returns the favor. He tells Gideon to arm these 300 soldiers with trumpets and torches, and then surround the Midianites at night and make all this noise in the hills, which sounds ridiculous, but Gideon does it. And the noise scares the Midianites into this frenzy. They start destroying each other in the dark while Gideon looks on safely from the hills.
So this story isn't offering the reader tips for discerning God's will.
No, it's about God's commitment to use weak people with deep flaws to do more than they could have imagined.
Okay, so short scenes, like Gideon and the fleece, are combined with other scenes making up a larger plot line. And tracing the conflict and resolution through the plot helps you see the message the author's trying to get across.
Now, Gideon's story has been set alongside many other stories that are also about these flawed, often questionable leaders called judges. And each of these has its own internal plot line. But then altogether they make up a whole movement of the biblical story, the period of the judges, and that has its own unified plot line.
And there are many movements within the story of the Bible.
Exactly. And all the smaller stories, hundreds of them, they fit within the context of their own movements, and then these movements together make up the building blocks of the grand plot line of the whole story of the Bible.
So no matter where I'm reading in the Bible, I need to pay attention to these different layers of plot so I can read each story in context.
Exactly. The Bible is such a sophisticated piece of literature. And so all these smaller plot lines keep overlapping, building up the tension. And when you back up, you can see how they've all been woven together into the unified story that leads to Jesus. Hey guys, thanks for watching this video by The Bible Project.
We hope you enjoyed it. It's an ongoing series on how to read the Bible, and we've got another one on character coming up soon.
So I imagine that Joe appreciated this one because you have to read it in context, right? Yeah. Did anybody pull anything out of that you maybe didn't realize before, or did it kind of set you up in a way that you maybe hadn't been set up for before? They were confused. I mean, that was kind of just the point of that. They were confused. That's why they did that. Yep. Yeah. I'm more thinking of how plot lines work together, how biblical narrative is set up. It's very easy to read the Bible in small little sections and not see how they're connected to each other, because that's how we do it on Sunday morning, unfortunately. Well, and it's hard not to, because you have how much time? It's not like you can do the whole thing. But that's why I do things like take the book of Jonah and tell the story of the book of Jonah. You have to take a step back to get the whole picture. But even, you tell the story of the book of Jonah, that's just one of the prophets. And so that's told in the context of other prophets, right? So,
But for somebody that has never read the book of Jonah
yeah.
and didn't get the before of what we read today,
Yeah.
that's a totally different meaning.
Yes. Yeah. So it's very easy to take something where you just take a small section of it and take it out of context. And you get a completely different meaning from it. And I know plenty of preachers who do that, not because they're necessarily lazy or they don't know what's going on, but it's a little bit they're lazy. It fits with what, with the cultural or contextual thing that they want to talk about for that day, so they just take that very small piece of it, which sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it does fit in. Sometimes it does not. And you do a disservice to the narrative when you do that. You make the narrative too small. So that's just keep this in mind. Yeah.
I think it's a lot like telling any story, like learning history in school or
Yes.
listening to a news story.
Yes.
that's missing or there's not enough
Yeah. And then when you don't get something in context, it's easy to take the small pieces or facts that you have and twist them for your own purposes, agenda, your own propaganda. And sometimes that's done in ways that are intentionally done that way, and sometimes it's done unintentionally. So take that for what it's worth.
You can make it say whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
Context.
Yeah.
You can use it in both directions, good and bad.
The biblical narrative, you can absolutely, if you go to the Bible looking for what you want to find, you will find it, as long as you ignore other pieces, right? You'll find what you want to find. Partially because the Bible is a very complicated and nuanced book. There's lots of different angles to it. So let's go on to the next. Character. I love their animation for this.
How to read biblical narrative, or in other words, how to read stories.
Right, and one of the main ingredients of any good story is characters who encounter conflict and then have to overcome it.
Yeah, let's talk about characters. In most stories, we quickly identify with characters because, just like them, we're in our own story having our own conflicts that we need to overcome.
Yeah, and good stories have characters with relatable struggles. We can watch them react to these challenges in different ways, and we get to see what happens as a result. Through characters, an author can show us their view of what it means to be human. The Bible's no different. Biblical stories use characters as a mirror so we can see ourselves and discover our own human nature in the reflection.
The thing about characters in the Bible is that they can be hard to relate to. I mean, often there's very little detail given about them.
Yeah, biblical authors develop characters differently than modern narratives. They prefer to communicate a lot through minimal detail. For example, we rarely hear what people look like in the Bible, but when we do, it's crucially important for the story.
Like we're told that Saul is tall and David was kind of a runt.
And these become images of their moral character. Saul's height matches his love of status and power to impose authority, while David humbly accepts his low status and allows God to exalt and deliver him.
So people's physical appearances are symbolic.
Yeah, very often. Like Esau's hairy body fits his animal-like behavior, and Jacob's smooth skin matches his deceptive, slippery nature.
What other clues do we get about biblical characters?
Well, often people's names symbolize their role in the story. Abraham in Hebrew sounds like father of a multitude. Jacob means deceiver. Ruth means refreshment. And Saul, his name means the one asked for. He's the flawed king that the people requested.
So by packing all this meaning with very little detail, biblical stories can do a lot in a little space.
And they even leave out things that modern readers want to know about these characters. Like they rarely come out and tell us people's thoughts or motives.
Right, like when Moses saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite, he kills him on the spot. But why? Was this righteous anger, or did he just lose his cool? And was it okay with God that he did it?
Yeah, we're not told. Because biblical authors usually avoid giving moral commentary. They would rather have a character's words and actions reveal their motives, and then leave us to judge their behavior by seeing the consequences. So in the case of Moses, this murders the beginning of a pattern of his anger getting the best of him with bad results. This choice forces him to run and hide in the desert for 40 years.
So it was a bad thing. But he does meet his wife out there, so it's a good thing?
Exactly. It forces you to ponder. Through all these techniques, the biblical narrators keep their stories compact, memorable, but also engaging.
But seriously, was Moses being good or bad? Right? Like in classic stories, there's always a good guy and a bad guy, some admirable hero who faces off against some horrible villain.
Sure, and simplified characters like that are helpful for teaching children there's such a thing as good and evil, but the Bible's not a children's book. Its characters are very complex, a mixed bag of good and evil, just like us. There's hardly any flawless characters in the Bible.
What about heroes of the faith, like Abraham or King David?
So you mean Abraham, who used an Egyptian slave for sex and then lied about his wife 2 times to save his own neck? And David, the man after God's own heart, who sleeps with another man's wife and then murders him? These stories are anything but simplistic. They offer us realistic portraits of compromised people like ourselves. The real surprise is that God keeps working with them despite their failures.
So, just because a person's called by God or wins a battle, becomes successful or wealthy, doesn't mean the biblical author wants me to act like them.
Right. It would actually be really dangerous to imitate most biblical characters.
True. But there must be something admirable in biblical characters, something I can imitate.
Absolutely. Pay attention, and you'll notice that most biblical stories highlight the moments when characters fail or come to the end of themselves, and then they choose radical trust in God's grace and wisdom. It's in these stories that the authors show us how to be a human who truly pleases God through humility and surrender.
Yeah, the fact that God stays committed to biblical characters is a profound statement about the patience and love of God, who is also a character.
Right. And by studying biblical characters, we can observe our own worst tendencies on display. And we see time and again God's gracious response that will see this story through to the end.
Hey you guys, we hope this video was helpful for you on how to understand character.
So I appreciate the piece about pointing out that there is not a lot of details that are given about the characters that we encounter in the Bible, and that when we do have details, they're meaningful, right? So now, when we read through these stories, we'll hear a detail and we'll go, why are they telling us that, right? You'll know it's there for a reason. Can you think of any characters that stand out at you that have a description? John the Baptist is the first one that I think of, right? Right, they're clearly saying something by giving us the description. I mean, the ones that he mentioned, of course. I had not really thought of, the smooth skin kind of reflecting the kind of slimy nature or whatever, right? Right, but now I'll go through, I'm like, oh yeah, that is something that they're trying to depict there. And the other piece that they brought out that I really appreciate is God working through flawed people, even heroes of the faith that are ultimately flawed, right? I think part of what we're supposed to do with that, part of what I have done with that is, I see my own self, my own flaws being reflected in that, but then I go, well, I'm not that bad though. I didn't do what they did. And if God can work through them, God certainly can work through me, right? I think that's part of what's going on with that character development stuff. So, any other things that you guys picked up through that?
Well, I was thinking of all the things they don't say in the Bible that's kind of taken for granted. And since I raised sheep, it means different to me than a lot of other people who have
Who don't have that context, yep.
So I think about that too.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
everyone has some knowledge that maybe brings a story to them a little different.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't have to be sheep.
That's right. That's right. We all bring our own life experiences with us when we read things, and that's why it's really interesting to read anything really, but particularly the Bible in groups, right? Because you only ever encounter a text from your own perspective, but when you can actually talk about it with other people, there are different things that are brought out. Just like when we did for book group, the Octavia Butler book. Were any of you in on that conversation? Were you in on that? I don't remember. I think maybe you were. Parable of the Sower, Octavia Butler. that conversation was interesting because we came at it from all of these different angles, and after having the book club discussion, you appreciate the book in a different way because you've heard other people's perspectives. And when the book is fresh in your mind, you can kind of reach back into it and go, oh yeah, I could see that piece of it. So
I think the thing I picked out of it was when he said the Bible's not a children's book.
yeah, it is not.
That's why we put Bible stories together.
Yeah. Right. And so it is always an interesting transition when you leave the children's Bible stories to the actual Bible, right? And you have to do it at a certain point, sometimes a little bit sooner than you would think. Otherwise, kids are starting to they're more sophisticated than they used to be, right? And so they'll see through a simple story and be like, well, what is this, right? But all those things that they were to all of those stories that they were bringing up, those characters, like those are way more complex, and it's not a children's story. And there have been times when you tell the story of Noah, and kids are used to, there was a flood, and then there was a rainbow, and we put these beautiful ark things on nursery, and so they've been surrounded by the story for their childhood, and then you hear the story of all of the death and destruction that happens with that story when you actually read it, and you also hear of what Noah does after they come out, and it's rather, and if you don't know that story, go and read it so you could be scandalized. Go read that story. Because when you tell it with kids and parents haven't read the story and they go home and the kids tell their parents what they learned about in confirmation class, ooh. Yeah.
Or that Solomon had 700 wives.
Yes, that was hilarious. Solomon had 700 lives. And what did Wes say?
Well, Wes went to Joanne's grandma and
Yeah.
said, hey, Solomon had 700 wives. And immediately, Joanne,
Yeah.
she goes, well, he was a busy man. and I think of that all the time.
Yes.
I can't think of Solomon without thinking that.
Yes. What were you going to say, Tim?
They threw out a line about God being a character. That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Because I don't think I've ever thought of God as a character in the Bible.
Right.
We kind of think of him as author.
Yeah. So, but he is a character, or, I mean, I shouldn't say he. God is a character, right? Because God kind of includes all of us, right? But it's also important to remember that there's not just one God depicted in the Bible. And what I mean by that is there are all of these different books from these different perspectives, and it's our human projection of our statement of faith of who we believe God to be that we encounter in the Bible, right? Because this is kind of filtered through human hands, human stories. So it's not just one perspective of who God is. I shouldn't say multiple gods. I say one perspective of God. So we have God as described by many and various angles, right? But God does play a role and is a character in the narrative when you just purely speak about narrative. Yeah. Okay. I want to see. I want to just click on the next one, but then I never know if the next one is the actual one in the order. Uh-oh. Setting.
Story you've ever heard. The action took place somewhere, and that place is called the setting. And since we've been learning how to read biblical narratives, let's talk about how settings work in the Bible.
So, settings are a crucially important tool in the hands of the biblical authors.
Really?
Yeah, think of it this way. When you start a story, everything is new. The plot and the characters are a mystery until things unfold.
Yeah, we have no idea what to expect.
Except, authors can use the setting of a story to prepare you for what's coming.
How so?
Well, let's say a story begins in a courtroom. What do you think is going to happen?
I expect a story about crime and justice.
Yeah, or how about the setting of a dark, old, rundown house?
Oh, something scary is about to happen.
Exactly. So settings evoke memories and emotions because of other stories you know that happened in similar places. The authors know this, and they can use settings to generate expectations about what could happen in this story. And a good author will get creative with settings, and he'll mess with your expectations in order to make a point.
This happens in the Bible?
All over the place. For example, think about the setting Egypt in the Bible.
Yeah, big Middle Eastern empire on the Nile.
Sure. Now think about the first biblical story where someone ends up in Egypt. It's about Abraham. God calls him to journey by faith to a new land, and he promises to give him a huge family. So he sets out, but he arrives during a famine. Now, is he going to trust God and stay in the promised land? Or will he leave the land and go look for food on his own?
Yeah, Abraham leaves and goes down to Egypt.
And there in Egypt, things go downhill fast. Abraham denies that Sarah is his wife to save his own neck, and then Pharaoh tries to marry her for himself.
Okay, first impression of Egypt, not a great place to visit.
But God then rescues them. He strikes Egypt with plagues, and so Pharaoh relents and sends Abraham away with loads of wealth. So, what do we learn about Egypt as a setting from the story?
It's the place people end up because of stupid decisions, but it's also a place where God comes and rescues his people.
Yep, and the next main story in Egypt follows the same pattern. Abraham's great-grandsons make a bunch of stupid choices, and they eventually lead them to Egypt because of another famine.
Down in Egypt, duh.
So generations pass, and the family ends up as slaves in Egypt, and what do you think's gonna happen?
God's gonna send some plagues and rescue his people.
It's like you saw it coming. After the Israelites get back to the Promised Land, God tells them to never go back to Egypt for any reason. It's the place of trouble and oppression.
So when future biblical characters go to Egypt, I'm supposed to cringe.
Right. Like Solomon, at the peak of his wealth and power, he married the king of Egypt's daughter, and then he started sending Israelites there to import Egyptian stallions. And then, a generation later, that alliance goes bad. Egypt oppresses Israel all over again.
So biblical settings carry with them all these memories of previous stories, which create expectation.
Yeah, it's a brilliant literary device to infuse stories with meaning. Now, biblical authors, they're brilliant. They can build up your expectations, but also creatively mess with them.
Like how?
Egypt's a perfect example. In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is born, his family flees to Egypt.
Uh-oh, so this is a problem.
And you would think so, but pay attention. Instead of Egypt being the bad place, it's the place of safety. Because who are they fleeing from? King Herod, who is behaving exactly like Pharaoh did, but he rules Jerusalem, not Egypt.
Matthew is messing with me to show how Jerusalem has become Egypt.
Exactly. You can find these kinds of patterns in many different biblical settings. Babylon, Moab, the wilderness, Bethlehem, the list goes on.
Which is a big list.
And it gets bigger, because sometimes the setting isn't just a place on a map, it's a type of situation. But they work the same way that settings do. For example, when people move toward the east, expect trouble. Adam and Eve were banished to the east, and then Cain wanders to the east.
People move to the east to build Babylon.
And all of these narratives are designed to point forward to when the Israelites as a people will be exiled to the east in Babylon.
Ah, nice.
Which leads to one more type of setting in biblical narrative, and that's time, or how long events take. Like, time periods of 40 are often associated with stories where people's faithfulness is tested. Noah in the boat for 40 days and 40 nights. Then he gets off and gets totally drunk. The Israelites got impatient during their 40 days of waiting for Moses on Mount Sinai, so they made the golden calf. Or after the Israelite spies investigate the land for 40 days, the people rebel, so they have to wander in the desert for 40 years.
But then there's the story of Jesus, who is tested in the desert for 40 days, and he reverses the expectation. He overcomes the test.
Exactly. A across the whole Bible, places, situations, and time periods become full of meaning by evoking memories and setting expectations. And the New Testament authors reuse all of these settings to show how Jesus is the one carrying our world from the garden, out of Egypt and the wilderness, and into the new creation.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video on how to understand setting and biblical narrative. We hope you enjoyed it. We make...
All right. So, we'll have time, I think, for one more here in a second. Yeah, maybe we'll have time for two. We'll just get to them quickly. The thing that I appreciated about the setting is it's starting to show us this pattern of flipping our expectation, right? As the Old Testament narrative kind of sets us up and points us towards Jesus, and Jesus is going to come in and be this kind of new human acting in a new way. So it takes all of our old patterns that do not work for us and flips them around, and he becomes this new pattern of a new human, a way for us to model our lives after. So that's a big part of that. Let's get into setting 4, unless anybody has anything that they want to reflect on with that last one. I want to kind of push through and, yeah.
Another interesting thing is, for those of us who tend to look at the Bible as historical or looking for details, that video reminded me that the setting is often symbolic and not
Yes.
necessarily meant to portray
Yes.
actual
Events or history, right.
So we have
Right.
our own idea of what a place is based on what it is modern,
Yes.
in the modern era.
Yep. Yeah. That's a very good reminder of that. Yeah. It's also helpful to look at this as narrative too, because oftentimes whoever is writing the narrative is doing so from a time distance back from when things actually happened. And in so doing, they're able to craft part of this overall narrative into the thing, but they have to manipulate some of what happened in order for it to kind of fit. So it's not necessarily a history book, right? This is not a history of what happened. It's a narrative of a faith, a group of people's faith. So that story will come out in kind of different ways. Yes.
I'd be interested to find out really how many years, as soon as he started talking about everybody that went to Egypt, something happened.
Yeah.
First thing in mind, how many of you actually thought Jesus before he said it?
I thought that right away because I knew it was a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Safety thing.
Yeah, it was a haven. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. It was a lot later. Yeah, but you see how that it flipped the expectations. So you have all of this stuff with Egypt of it being a place where bad stuff happens or where foolish things happen. And Jesus going there is actually a good thing, right? Because was Egypt chosen because it flipped that particular perspective, right?
There's something in, where I saw that, but doesn't it say something about out of Egypt I called my son, some kind of a
Mhm.
scripture? Where is that? That is,
We could look it up. I don't know exactly where it is.
just remind me that they did that because it was fulfilling the scripture,
Mm-hmm.
which was
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But to figure out what was it he said, I never thought of reverse.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's move on to the design patterns and see what that has for us.
How biblical narratives work. And it turns out stories in the Bible are like any other story. You've got to pay attention to the characters, the setting, and the plot.
Yeah, these are the basic tools an author uses to help readers see the meaning and significance of the events. Now, it's time to learn one final skill that will bring all these elements together: how to detect design patterns in biblical narrative.
What do you mean by design patterns?
Well, the biblical authors have shaped all these elements, character, setting, and plot, to create series of repeated patterns that weave through story after story and tie them all together. When you notice these patterns, you'll see how different stories across the whole Bible have been coordinated to emphasize key themes.
This sounds interesting, but how do you know how to find a biblical pattern?
Well, biblical authors do it subtly. The best way to catch on is to watch them embed key words and images that link stories together. Take, for example, one of the main themes of the Bible, the complex and tragic human condition.
Okay.
So let's start at the beginning, where God is making a really good world.
Right, 7 times it says God saw that it was good.
So those are clearly important words. Now watch. God appoints 2 characters named Human and Life to rule this world on his behalf, and they're told that everything is good for them to eat.
Except for the tree of knowing good and evil.
So then the humans doubt God, and in Genesis we read, they see that it's good to take this knowledge for themselves. Then we read, they desire to become wise, and then finally, they take what they want.
And everything falls apart. This story is about the human condition.
And on its own, it's a really powerful story, but the biblical authors don't leave it there. They turn it into a pattern. It happens again with Abraham and Sarah. God brings them into the promised land, promises them a child. But they don't trust God, they get impatient, and we read the same words. They see their Egyptian slave, they take her and do what is good in their eyes. You get it?
Yeah, the stories match.
Then you get to Aaron at Mount Sinai, and we read how he sees and then takes the gold of the Israelites to make the golden calf. Or there's the story about Achan, who sees the gold of the Canaanites, he desires it and takes it for himself.
This pattern highlights how one person's temptation can create suffering for many people.
Exactly. It's just like the story of Saul, where we read that the Israelites see him. They desire him and take him as their king so they can be like all the other nations.
And Saul's reign leads them to destruction.
Or there's the story of David, which says that he sees Bathsheba, he desires her and then takes her and then kills her husband.
And then David's family starts destroying each other.
So you see, it's just one basic theme repeated over and over. These stories are all designed to show the temptation pattern.
Which is kind of a downer.
But the repetition builds up anticipation. Perhaps someone will come and break the pattern. This is why the stories of Jesus have been designed to carry the patterns forward to their climax.
Really?
Yeah, like what does Jesus say when he's faced with his greatest temptation to avoid dying on the cross?
Not my desire, but your desire be done.
So the pattern flips, and you have one person resisting temptation, and his suffering provides life for many.
Very cool. Can we do one more?
Totally. How about a big one? How God brings humanity through chaotic waters into a new world. It starts on page 1, where God separates these dark, chaotic waters.
Yeah, dry land emerges as a home for humans to flourish.
Then the pattern reappears with the chaotic waters of the flood. God rescues this remnant, Noah and his family, through the waters so that they can step onto dry land and become humanity 2.0. Now, does that basic storyline remind you of anything else?
Oh, right, the famous Exodus story.
Exactly. That's when God saves his chosen people from Egypt by leading them through the waters onto dry land.
While Pharaoh and his armies destroyed.
The pattern repeats later with Joshua and the Israelites.
They passed through the waters of the Jordan into the promised land.
Yeah, you got it. So now you can see how later biblical authors will project this pattern into the future. Like Isaiah, he hoped for a new Exodus with a new king, leading God's people forward into a new creation. And in this repetition, the nations become the chaotic waters.
So you can see how combining all of these patterns brings us to Jesus.
Yeah, notice how all the Gospels highlight that story of Jesus going to the Jordan River. He goes into the waters and back out again.
His baptism.
That's when God announces that Jesus is his son, who will rescue the world from the chaos of our evil and violence by going into death and out the other side. This is why baptism became such a big deal for Jesus' followers. It's about participating in this ancient pattern, going through the waters of death, following Jesus into the new creation.
These design patterns seem really important.
Yeah, they're actually the main way biblical authors have unified these hundreds of stories together. And every pattern develops a core theme throughout the whole biblical story that leads to Jesus.
Great. That's biblical narrative, which makes up over 40% of the Bible. Now, another 30% is made up of ancient poetry.
And learning to read biblical poetry is what we'll explore in the next videos.
You just saw our 8th installment.
All right. There's 2 more. I think we'll probably call it good there. So did that kind of pull it all together for you? You kind of see all of the patterns and how they repeat themselves and how they kind of build on each other. Anything stand out to you with that?
Jesus is the big change, but we haven't changed the way he wanted us to.
Yeah.
Not be.
Right. So we have the template, so to speak, but we have to follow the template, right? We have all the patterns, but we need to make ourselves, right? To model ourselves on that template, right? Yeah.
You see another flip in there too,
Mm-hmm.
baptism of Christ, because it went from just being ritualistic cleansing to a totally different purpose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I thought I saw a hand go up. I think it was just my glasses. There's a smudge on them or something. It does. Yeah. All right. So I feel like we're set up pretty good. Next time you will meet and talk about continue with Genesis or moving on.
We're going to jump into another Old Testament book.
Okay.
Probably isn't really familiar to everyone, I'll leave it there. But we're going to do Bible study. And if you want, because I've printed it up, complete text words about the first 5 pages of this. If you want to bring colored pencils and rulers and markers, we're actually going to try this. We study the Bible by reading it and like, oh, there are 2 or 3 words that go, oh, I see this. So we're going to attack it from a different approach, which you may or may not like. I like it. But if you have colored pencils, you might want to bring it.
Yeah. And so now you'll be bringing all of this stuff in with you. So you might approach it in a slightly different way than you would have before you saw some of this stuff. So if you are interested at all, the Bible Project has tons of videos on their website. And please feel free to go explore, do stuff. They even have classes and stuff on there that you can take. And they're all free. So avail yourself of that. Any last thoughts before we go? All right. Thank you for your, yeah.
I have a question. How are you going into your surgery? How are you feeling? I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to pray for you.
I'm fine. I'm having kind of a thing, but yeah, it's kind of like I'm just ready for it to be done. Yeah. I've got a little abscess thing that is forming, which is another reason why, like, I get them and they have to take care of them, so this will take care of them. So, Tuesday, yeah. I'm not worried about the surgery. The recovery is apparently not so great. So, I'm hoping that is not as bad as some people have said. They're like, don't get your tonsils out as an adult. I'm like, well, except I'm in pain every single day. I don't really have a choice at this point. So, yeah.
Because surgery, somebody else is in charge.
Yeah, I'm asleep for the surgery. That's totally fine. It's yeah. I'm looking forward to that nap.
They always say get a good night's sleep, and I say why?
Why? You're going to be put out. Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, some of you I will see, well, one of you I will see tomorrow. So, counsel. Do that. Yeah. Melody's cell is going to be on backup for me. So is my husband. So if anything comes up, pastoral care wise, they'll help take care of that. Kathy Geib. Yeah. She's been here before.